Hello, Kempner Apes. Today we're going to be looking at Module 21, Community Succession. So community succession is all about kind of looking at how different ecosystems progress through time. So after we go through this module, you should be able to correctly identify primary succession and secondary succession. You should be able to compare and contrast those and talk a little bit about and describe how primary succession starts, how secondary succession starts. We're going to talk about aquatic succession and how that looks compared to terrestrial succession. And then we're going to kind of finish up and talk about how species richness can change in a community given the 4 different factors, and kind of talked about your lab with the theory of island biogeography today. Okay, so when we talk about succession, we're not talking about whether or not something reaches its goal. Though you can relate it to this, right? That there is an ultimate kind of climax community that we're trying to reach, a climax ecosystem that all regions, all ecosystems are trying to get at, right? So with primary succession, we're talking about an ecosystem that starts off with no soil whatsoever. So that's the first thing, one of the mnemonics or things that you need to remember, that primary succession starts with no soil. Right, so like it says here, virtually every community experienced some type of community or ecological succession. And these are predictable outcomes that, given the type of biome or region that we're looking at, different climates, different precipitations, temperatures, things like that, we can kind of correctly determine what type of plant species, animal species will come over a period of time. And that's what we mean when we talk about succession. So again, primary succession, what you need to really take away from this is that primary succession starts out with no soil. So when we're kind of talking about this or testing you on this, you've got to think of different types of ecosystems and what they look like, and how do we start off with no soil, right? And then we're going to kind of talk about that in a few minutes. And so you see this picture here, right? You have different types of ecosystems. You see here are different types of land. Right, you have exposed rock, lichen and moss, annual wildflowers, things like that as we go through. Right, so again, it says here primary succession, again, starts off with no soil. Primary succession, no soil. So it's exposed rock. So what soil is a product, it's a organic mixture of different things from decomposed matter, decomposed leaf litter. It does contain sediments, things like that. But when we talk about no soil, we're talking about rock. So for instance, ecosystems that start off with no soil would be like a volcanic eruption, right? If a volcano erupts and lava covers the area, it burns everything away, and then when it cools and hardens, it's actually some type of igneous rock. There's no soil available to that, right? So a volcanic eruption would be a event that leads to no soil. When humans come by and pave over, so like Kempner's parking lot, your driveway, for instance, contains no soil. So like if you abandon that area, if you abandon that your home, if you abandon a parking lot, that area has no soil. It's cement, it is concrete, it contains no type of organic matter for plants to grow, right? So those are different examples of areas that have no soil. What you know is the first organisms that come, the pioneer species of that area, will come in and start breaking down that rock. Those, like for instance, the lichen and moss here will grow on rock, and the lichen will wear away at the rock with some type of chemical weathering, some type of erosion event. It'll break it apart into smaller sediments, and then when the lichen die out or the moss die out, their organic matter will nutrify the soil, nutrify that rock, and start creating soil. And then we'll get annual wildflowers, perennial wildflowers. When those die out, they grow really fast and die out, grow really fast, die out. Then you've got longer lasting plant species like shrubs, trees, and then we get some of the bigger trees like maple, oak, things like that, pine, broadleaf trees that last a long time, right? And so that's just what we talk about with primary succession. And this happens also with animal species, that you've got smaller animals, rodents, insects that come in early, and then you've got some of your apex predators that come in towards the late part of succession, right? So primary succession, what you need to take away from this slide really is primary succession starts off with no soil, and that we've got exposed rock, lichen, and mosses coming in. Secondary succession starts with soil, right? So you don't notice the main difference between the previous slide and this slide is that We start off with annual wildflowers. So what are some events that lead to secondary succession? A forest fire, for instance. Right? When there's a forest fire that occurs, the plants burn away, but the soil is still there. A flooding event, right? If it's a flooding event that gets rid of some of the trees, a weather event, right? Gets rid of some of the trees, but the soil is still there. We start off with secondary succession. So instead of starting off with lichen and moss, we start off with our annual wildflowers because there's still soil present and those wildflowers and grasses can still grow, right? And then we move on to the next part, right? We move on to more to longer living plants, right? So just kind of remember the difference again is secondary succession starts with soil, primary succession starts with no soil. Aquatic ecosystems can also have some type of succession, right? So what is an example of a primary succession starting lake? So when we talk about glaciers melting or glacier retreat, right? Land-based ice that melts away. Usually what's under that ice is rock, right? There's no soil under that, right? And so that's an example of succession in a lake. But then what happens is algae will come in or some type of sediment will run off and start creating soil at the bottom. And as we create soil at the bottom, you start to see that some of these lakes, if there's not natural water feeding it, will start to get more shallow and get warmer. And as they get warmer and shallower, plants start to succeed. And over long periods of time, an open water lake like you see in this picture can eventually become a terrestrial biome, right? Where the sediments start filling in the gaps and you start changing the way that the geography of the area looks like, and you start filling in the lake, right? And so this is showing you here that in this open water lake, this is secondary succession primarily because you can still see the soil. There's no exposed rock, right? But as sediments start to run off into this area, so you could have sediments running off into here, it'll start filling up the lake, right? And this lake will get warmer and more shallow. And as it gets warmer and more shallow, you have the chance of increasing more plant growth. And again, after long periods of time, the lake basin could get filled. You've got a wet center, but you still it still covers the area. So you can have successions in lakes where you develop sediments, but over time, some of these lakes will fill up if there's not an open water source there that allows for the sediments to continue to move. All right, so let's test your knowledge, right? So what I need you to do is as we go through this and as you watch this video is can you tell me whether or not this area will start off with primary succession or secondary succession? So deforested land. So what does deforested mean? Deforested means that we've taken away all the vegetation, right? Whether that is clearing out an area for agriculture or like taking a field and taking away all the product of the field, right? Or you're in a forest and you're cutting down trees for lumbering practices, right? You're trying to collect wood to create pieces of timber, things like that, right? So deforested land, is that primary succession or secondary succession? I'll give you 3 seconds. All right, so deforested land is secondary succession, right? So this is secondary. I don't know why I was drawing that line. This is secondary succession, right? So we know that that's secondary succession because there is soil still there. We're taking away the trees, the vegetation, so secondary succession. A forest burned by a wildfire, right? So lightning strikes a forest, or you know there is a gender reveal party and starts a major forest fire, right? That forest fire burns away everything that's there. What is that going to start with, primary or secondary succession? Hopefully you said secondary succession because that is correct, right? Secondary succession, the fire will burn away. If it's not super intense, right, the soil will still be present. If it's a very, very intense fire, right, and the fire literally melts the soil and melts the rock, you could end up with primary, but most wildfires aren't that intense, and so it usually still leaves the soil there and exposed. All right, a lake created by glacial melt, right? So again, glaciers are land-based ice. When they melt away, right, you can create a lake, and they're very beautiful. If you've ever seen a glacial lake, they're very beautiful, very clear. There's not a lot of nutrients in there. So that lake, is it going to be primary or secondary succession? So when glaciers melt, right, what's underneath that glacier is usually exposed rock. And if it's exposed rock, and then it's not soil, so that is primary succession, right? So we'll add P right here. All right, an abandoned parking lot, like if we abandon Kentner High School, right, and the parking lot stays there for a long period of time, is that primary succession or secondary succession? Concrete and cement are just liquefied rock that we cool off and we create, and if we pave an area, we leave it undisturbed for a long period of time, we will always start off with primary succession because it's like starting off with rock. All right, a lake created by flooding a natural valley due to dams. So like, for instance, any lake in the state of Texas, except for a few of them, are all man-made lakes. So we've dammed up a river and we flooded an area, right? A natural area, right? So if we flood a natural area, right, there's still plant life there and we just filled it with water. Is that starting off as primary or secondary? Hopefully you said secondary because that is correct, right? Because secondary succession, a natural valley contains soil. So if we flood that area, it's starting off with secondary succession. So hopefully you are able to kind of figure out, this is a great way for you to test your knowledge. It's a great way for us to ask you questions on a test, right? So please make sure you know the difference between primary succession and secondary succession. All right, so species richness, if you remember from the last video, species richness is all about whether or not the number of species in a given area, right? And species richness is determined by a lot of, or influenced by a lot of different factors, right? Latitude, time, habitat size, distances from other communities, right? So let's think about this, for instance, right? So latitude, again, if we're talking about latitude, we're talking about the lines on the globe that go like this, right? So we're talking about latitude, right? As we go towards the equator, right, if we're going towards the equator this way, right, what do we know about species richness, right? Or if we're going from the equator this way, right, what do we know about species richness, right? So as we go through latitudes and we go towards the equator, we know that species richness tends to increase, right? Remember that there's not a lot of species up here at the poles, and there's not a lot of species at all because it's too cold. So as we head towards warmer climates, dependent again on latitude, you usually see an increase in your species richness, right? The number of species that are available, right? So you tend to see more species towards the center and not towards the poles, okay? Time, right? As time progresses, usually, specifically if we looked at succession, right? As time progresses, we know that species richness will increase over time, specifically if our extinction rate is lower than our speciation rate. So we know that time will increase species richness. Habitat size from your lab on the theory of island biogeography, you know that as habitat size increases, you tend to have more species richness. And then distances from other communities, again, based off your lab on the theory of island biogeography, you know, as you go from the mainland or from a hot spot, like an area that has high biodiversity, the further away you are from it, the lower your species richness can be, right? So hopefully you remember that from your lab. And then talking about biomes. Right, so you did a little bit of an experiment on the theory of island biogeography, right? And that was talking about the size of an island as well as distance from the mainland. And we found out, hopefully, most of your data kind of showed that a large island that is close to the mainland will be more species rich than an island that is small and further away, right? That the size of an island and the distance from the mainland will dramatically increase the amount of species that are found on that island, so to speak. And again, I'll always remind you that an island doesn't, and according to this theory, an island is not necessarily an island that's separated by water, right? It could be a mainland that is separated by some type of geographic isolator, like a hill, a mountain, a ravine, right? It could be man-made, like a road or a canal, right? We can have things like that that separate one area from another, and you could have different species come in, and again, the size and the distance from that mainland will determine how diverse that area will be, right? So in this one, this example, they show you number of bird species versus the island area size, right? So we know that as the area increases, that it usually tends to lead to more numbers of bird species in this in Lake Valence in Hungary, right? And then it kind of flattens out. There's a certain size where it reaches its climax community, right? Where there's a certain size on the island that maximizes the amount of species, right? But we know that as it increases, there's some correlation between the number of species and the island that you see, or the size of the island. Okay, so that's module 21, right? So we went through all of the module. Hopefully you understood a little bit about primary succession and secondary succession, and then how species richness is influenced by different factors. Okay, so have a great day. We'll see you soon.